I don't think I need to recount, at least for anybody in this audience, how at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, two English thinkers, Hilary Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, pondering the economic tragedy that was the 18th and 19th centuries in England, called for a restoration of property, a restoration to the common man and the ordinary English citizen of their ancient rights. And they raised this challenge to the dominant liberal culture just at the moment when that culture was at the zenith of its power. That is to say, they raised this challenge at the very moment when it seemed least likely to succeed. What I think is less well understood was that distributism was part and parcel of a much wider challenge to the liberal world order, a challenge that originated in many different sectors of society all at the same time. Indeed, the 20th century was largely a working out of some of these challenges, many of which failed, especially in the political and economic orders, challenges such as communism, fascism, and Nazism, and failed precisely because they were not really challenges at all, but extensions of the dominant liberalism. But in their place, other challengers have succeeded, and succeeded in areas as different as physics, religion, economics, and politics. And among winning challengers, we can count distributism, even if not under that name. For the name itself is a problem. More about this problem of the name a little later. It should be obvious, I think, that all political and economic discussion takes place within the limits of the dominant metaphor. Now, if one is challenging these limits, it's a good idea to understand just what these limits are and how they came to be. And if someone is attempting to change those limits, it is crucial to understand just how they change. What I will attempt to do in this talk is to briefly describe how we got to a civilization dominated by the metaphors of modernism. And then I wish to recount why the metaphors of modernism have not and cannot produce a realistic economic science or a sustainable economic order. And finally, I will attempt to show how those metaphors are changing, that the model of science is shifting once again, and distributism, in one form or another, is gaining ground and becoming widespread within the modern world. Every society, every culture, operates under certain assumptions that it takes for granted, and which guide all political, social, and cultural acts. These assumptions normally appear in the form of an overriding metaphor which everyone, or nearly, regards as true or given. They are expressed in their foundational stories, legends, and myths, which recount in symbolic and narrative forms the underlying assumptions of that culture and civilization. The overriding metaphor of all pre-modern civilizations was that the world was an organism filled with life. Growth was the norm, but growth into a form typical for that particular organism. And all the organisms were part of one divine organism. Central to the metaphor was the great chain of being, in which everything, starting with the lowest and seemingly most inconsequential, was connected in a hierarchy, and a hierarchy which always led to the divine. Every tree, every plant, the rivers, the oceans, the mountains, all had their guiding spirits, spirits which had to be at least respected, and perhaps even appeased. Being, existence, was not something apart from life. Rather, life was at the heart of being. The cultural task was to bring the social order into harmony with this living universe and to guide our lives and our societies according to its natural rhythms. All of this is to say that the model was organic and the universe a living organism. In the Christian version of this metaphor, man had dominion over nature. Excuse me. But it was the dominion of a father over a family, with the purpose of allowing each person, family, and community to fulfill its natural end, and providing the material, social, and cultural basis to allow them to do so. Hence, the purpose of any science in this period, including economic science, was to humanize the natural world to better advance the goals of building up the human person, the family, and the various communities, village, state, city, and nation, which constitute the human family. But in the modern world, the metaphor has shifted from the organic to the mechanical. Being was just a machine. And God, if he exists at all, is just the chief engineer, architect, and mechanic. Even life itself was no more than a particular arrangement of atoms, and consciousness itself was no more than a certain structure, say a cerebral cortex, that gave the illusions of awareness, thought, and feelings. Even love could be reduced to chemistry. In this mechanical world, all forms are accidental rather than natural. Everything can be otherwise than it is and may be remade into any convenient form. In this context, the idea of dominion shifted from that of a father to that of a tyrant, one capable of exploiting nature for private or public gain. There are no natural limits that this tyrant, man, cannot overcome. This exploitation of nature is carried out in the context of the survival of the fittest and the war of all against all, upon which this survival is thought to depend. This philosophy isolated the human person and reduced him to the individual, with families and communities reduced to an epiphenomenon of individual transactions, with each transaction having personal gain as the sole end. The task of politics, excuse me, uh, so the 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 philosophy isolated and each the task of politics and culture now shifted to appropriating the methods of this universal machine and exploiting them to our advantage. This march towards modernism actually begins with the scholastics. Thomas Aquinas and his colleagues had tremendous confidence in the ability of the human intellect to comprehend the world. But Aquinas made a fatal move, one that seemed innocent enough at the time, but would have far-reaching consequences. He asserted that the same thing cannot be both seen and believed, and he concluded by saying, "Hence it follows that the same thing cannot be an object of both faith and science." In other words, he separated faith and science and made science the superior of faith. Of course, Thomas was talking about mundane matters and took faith for granted. But he did assert that the world could be understood quite apart from religion. This set off a quest to comprehend the world by unaided reason alone, and hence apart from the great chain of being. So, it is little wonder that Francis Bacon would imagine a world free of religious influence, where a steady gaze at nature alone would reveal all truth, and the priests and bishops would be scientific sages. In the next generation, René Descartes could imagine the world as a vast machine and space as flat, uniform, and invariant, and which presented no problem that could not be solved by coordinate geometry. The organic model was dissolving. Now, Descartes did not imagine that he was raising any challenge to the Catholic faith. Quite the contrary. But he opened up a space in which a desacralized vision of the world could flourish. The real success of the Cartesian vision came in the 18th century with Isaac Newton. The ancient astronomers had, more or less accurately, mapped the movement of the heavens, but they could not provide any explanation for those movements. But Newton, with a few simple formulas operating in a flat Cartesian space, had solved a problem that had plagued science for at least 3,000 years. The effect was electrifying. The English Catholic poet Alexander Pope, reflecting the common opinion, wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." The success of Newton's physics set off a search for similar Newtonian principles to guide every other science, even, or especially, the sciences of politics and economics. Somehow, the markets had to be guided by a simple, fundamental law. If it worked for the complex motions of the stars, surely there must be a similar principle for the motions of the markets. As the 19th century economist William Jevons put it, all we needed were better statistics. Once the statistics had been gathered, the generalization of laws from them will render economics a science as exact as many of the physical sciences. But the markets proved somewhat resistant to the new model. There just didn't seem to be a simple formula, a Newtonian principle to govern the movements of the markets, and Jevons' exact system of statistics seemed out of reach. People still spoke only of the political economy, meaning that the market was inscribed within political order, as it had been since the time of Aristotle, and could not be understood apart from that order. Then, in 1891, things changed when A.E. Marshall published his Principles of Economics. It is noteworthy that this is the first use of the term economics in the current sense. Indeed, the term was so new that Marshall had to explain what he meant by it in the very first sentence. Marshall's Newtonian principle was to reduce all things economic, and especially land and labor, to elements of the capital fund, which should be purchased at the lowest possible price, a price which could then be plotted in a neutral Cartesian space to produce the ubiquitous supply and demand charts that decorate all of our economic texts, and which purport to reduce all the movements of the markets to neat, straight lines, in much the same way that Newton's charts explained the motions of the heavens. Economics now had its Newtonian principle. Marshall's theory might have established economics as a physical science, but it bore little relation to the physical world and resulted in any number of absurdities. It would be a day-long task to point out all of these absurdities, so I will concentrate on just two: the mathematical absurdity and the absurdity of commodified labor. Marshall's error was to imagine supply and demand as independent variables which could be solved with linear equations, the kind of equations that produce those nice straight lines that we are accustomed to see in the textbooks. But they are not independent variables. They are codependent. Supply and demand represent the division of rewards between suppliers, mostly firms, and demanders, mostly workers. So, for example, a division which gives the suppliers a larger proportion of the rewards will result in one demand curve, and a division which gives the bulk to the workers will give a completely different curve. And since we are dealing with physical quantities, it is zero-sum and codependent. The more that is given to one, the less that is given to the other. That is to say, supply and demand are not independent but codependent variables, and codependent variables cannot be solved with linear equations. Their solution requires differential equations, and such equations do not yield the simple charts that were so appealing to Marshall. Rather, they yield charts of enormous complexity where supply and demand rotate around attractor points but never quite reach them, and result in wild and unexpected swings. It is not hard to judge which set of charts more accurately describes the economies we actually see. The irony in Marshall's charts is that they assume a well-distributed production system, a system where every product is produced by a vast number of firms, such that no firm has any pricing power. They are all price takers rather than price makers. In other words, Marshall's system would only work in an economy of well-distributed property. Alas, that is not the economy we have now, and wasn't even true in Marshall's day. I don't know how things are in Italy, but in the United States, nearly every market sector, from beer to banking, from eyeglasses to entertainment, are dominated by a few vast corporate collectives, with from 2 to 5 firms controlling 80% of any given market sector, and always acting together as a cartel to set prices. For example, here we go to the grocery store and we see dozens of brands of breakfast cereal, and we think, the free market at work. But in truth, there are only 2 companies behind the varied boxes: Kellogg's and Post. Even the private label brands are made in their factories and just put in different boxes. So the great irony is that Marshall's free market capitalism would only work in a distributist economy. But as for actually existing capitalism, it has collectivized the economy beyond the dreams of any Stalinist bureaucrat. Or as Chesterton put it, capitalism and communism are very much alike, especially capitalism. The mathematical error is serious enough, but Marshall made an even more basic error. He treated labor as just another commodity to be purchased at the lowest possible price. But labor is also required to purchase the bulk of goods offered for sale. In other words, one commodity, priced as a commodity, is supposed to purchase all the other commodities. This is simply not possible. Again, G.K. Chesterton spotted the error from the first. Capitalism, he said, is contradictory as soon as it is complete, because it is dealing with the mass of men in two opposite ways at once. When most men are wage earners, it is more and more difficult for most men to be customers. For the capitalist is always trying to cut down what his servant demands, and in doing so is cutting down what his customer can spend. He is wanting the same man to be rich and poor at the same time. The inability of commodified labor to absorb all the output explains another rather perplexing aspect of capitalist systems. They purport to believe in limited government, but the historical reality is that big capitalism and big government grow together, the one feeding off the other. This is not a matter of ideology, but of necessity. If commodified labor cannot absorb the output, then the economy requires a consumer of last resort, one capable of clearing the markets. Markets that cannot, even in principle, be cleared by commodified labor. Government has always fulfilled this role. Big government filled the role the commodified consumer cannot possibly fill. Indeed, in the heyday of free market capitalism, which in England began with the victory of the Liberal Party in 1832, and in the United States with the victory of the Republican Party in 1860, and these regimes lasted until 1929, the business cycle, from boom to bust, averaged only 3.8 years. It was a time of chaos for both capital and labor, and posed a problem that could only be solved either by the overthrow of capitalism or by the growth of government. Within the limits of liberalism, there really is no third choice. Without this gargantuan consumer, capitalism is incapable of clearing its own markets. I could continue to discourse on the absurdities of capitalism for the rest of this conference, but in the interests of time, allow me to summarize some of them. Capitalism claims to be a free market system, but it has destroyed the freedom of the market. It claims to be a system of limited government, but it has led to the unprecedented expansion of government. It claims to be a system of private property, but most productive property is gathered into vast corporate collectives. It claims to be a system of efficiency, but its success is measured by the height of its garbage dumps, the visible sign of inefficiency. It claims to liberate the individual, but has only made him more dependent on big government and big business. It claims to be a pure science, but its formulations bear little resemblance to the real world. In short, capitalism claims the mantles of free markets and limited government, but destroys the first and grows the second to gargantuan proportions. I would like now to return to the question of the challenges to the modernist ideologies. For just as they achieved their apogee in Cartesian space and Newtonian mechanics, so it was in the very fields of astronomy and physics that this worldview began to collapse, and its metaphors no longer held. At the end of the 19th century, Lord Kelvin, one of the leading physicists of his day, could declare that only two problems remained for physics to be complete: the problem of black box radiation, and the search for the luminiferous ether. Alas, rather than completing physics, the solution to these problems opened up whole new models of how the world works. In place of the flat space and simple mechanics of Newton and Descartes, we entered the world of relativity, uncertainty, curved space, and the quantum. Now, I will not pretend to be much of an expert on quantum mechanics, but this much I can say. The very name quantum mechanics is ironic, since the system is anything but mechanical, at least not in the Newtonian sense. Each new advance seems only to open up new marvels, so that the universe is once again marvelous. It is almost as if the great chain of being is being restored. And if this chain does not, as yet, lead directly to God, at least it leads to a situation where God is as good an explanation as any other on offer. Newton may have brought light to physics, but it turns out that both light and physics are something entirely different from what the Newtonians thought they were. It is, I think, no accident that Chesterton and Belloc were raising their challenges to the accepted system at the same time that Albert Einstein and Max Planck were raising theirs. Cultural changes frequently emerge from different directions all at once. And the reasons for doubting the scientific pretensions of liberalism began to grow after the long recession of 1873, which formally lasted until 1879, but actually continued on and off until the Great Depression of 1929. Indeed, in the 20th century, communism, fascism, and Nazism were all attempts to soften capitalism and bring the economy under state control. But it was often difficult to tell just who was controlling whom. And after the war, Western Europe reached a kind of economic truce by establishing social democracies, a flawed but functioning compromise. But the challenges to modernism came not only in scientific and economic realms, but from art, literature, theology, and philosophy. Philosophers as diverse as Alasdair MacIntyre and Slavoj Žižek are bringing modernist assumptions into question in a broad-based movement called postmodernism. Now, it doesn't really matter if one agrees or disagrees with this particular flavor of this movement. The point is that dissent from modernism is now becoming more and more the rule rather than the exception. But one challenge in particular that I would like to highlight is the one raised by Catholic social teaching, and that is the challenge to individualism itself. This challenge has a name, personalism, and that name highlights the great modern delusion. Under liberalism, we are all self-interested atoms whose interactions aim only at our personal advantage and produce the illusion of social order. Or, as Margaret Thatcher put it, there is no such thing as society. But personalism recognizes the obvious fact that all of us have two things: a family name and a native language. That is to say, we all emerge not only from the womb of the mother, but also from the womb of the family, and could not survive a day without that womb. And we all receive a rich cultural inheritance that makes us what we are. And we receive these things, being, language, culture, as pure gifts. We exchanged nothing for them. That is to say, culture and society are prior to the individual. In the modernist philosophies, the individual seeks only his own advantage in isolation from others. But in personalism, the human person seeks his own development within the common good and the community and in community with others. And each of these philosophies results not only in a different conception of social order, but of business organization as well, and a new conception of business organization that is now gaining ground. By the middle of the 20th century, it was evident to all that capitalism could not survive in its pure form. The wars and economic instability were proof enough of that. So the effort to save capitalism from itself came in the form of redistributing the income through various means, such as increasing the bargaining power of labor through unionization, raising the minimum wage, redistributing the output through welfare, and through making certain goods like health care resemble common goods freely available at or available at low cost. But as praiseworthy as all these efforts are, they do not get to the root of the problem. They ameliorate capitalism, but leave it intact with all of its flaws. This is because they do not address the basic question, the question of property. As long as property is gathered into corporate collectives, capitalism can only be that which it is. And the state will be just another vast collective, but one that we are all forced to join. But the culture is now resulting in both a managerial revolution and an ownership revolution. More and more, the ideas of shared ownership and control are becoming part of management practice. That is to say, distributism itself is moving to the heart of management and business theory and practice. Few of the practitioners, I suspect, are aware of the pioneering work of Chesterton and Belloc, and all would be surprised to find that the distributists got there first. This is understandable, since the distributism of the Chester-Belloc was often regarded as mere agrarian nostalgia, a mere 3 acres and a cow romanticism. But in fact, the most important victories and exemplars of distributism are in the industrial sector. We think of the Mondragon cooperatives or the cooperative economy of Emilia-Romagna. But the ideas they pioneered are now moving to the heart of management science and doing so worldwide. In the United States, we have many enterprises like the Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation. Its founder, Jack Stack, has written A Stake in the Outcome, which is a kind of textbook for practical distributism and details how we built up a very small operation into a very large company merely by including the workers in the ownership, operation, and control of the company. Likewise, in Brazil, we find Ricardo Sembler, who inherited a small company called Semco and turned it into a flourishing conglomerate through the practice of employee control and profit sharing. His book, The 7-Day Weekend, could be considered a manual for the practice of distributism. Frederic Laloux has written Reinventing Organizations, which documents the rise of employee ownership and control across a large number of mostly European enterprises. In this regard, I think we distributists, who have not already done so, need to become more familiar with this growing body of works. There is a long list of them. But I suspect that most distributists are unaware of just how successful their theories are. I think it fair to say that we have practiced a certain degree of self-isolation. It is time, I believe, to join in these wider movements because we still have something to offer which most of these authors have not yet quite grasped. One of the problems comes in the very name distributism, which sounds vaguely socialist to many people. And in one sense, at least, it is. In fact, it socializes property more effectively than socialism, which merely collectivizes it. But that raises fears in people who are worried about their own property. Indeed, the American Chesterton Society has dropped the name Distributism entirely and replaced it with the term localism. But I think this is a big mistake. Localizing government without distributing property will mean that the local is powerless in the face of vast concentrations of economic power. Whatever one thinks the proper size of government should be, it needs to be as large as the largest economic power it governs. I think we can imitate the strategy of the capitalists by a more conscious association of distributism with free markets and local government. After all, we can honestly do this, which the capitalists certainly cannot. Indeed, neoclassical economics, the economics that Marshall and his descendants um, uh, uh, proclaimed, can only work when property is well distributed. And the radical distinctions between workers and owners are lessened or eliminated. Then the division of rewards between suppliers and demanders, the division upon which the supply and demand charts depend, finds a natural and stable solution. And neoclassical economics becomes a useful, if incomplete, description of economic order. But beyond that, there is an element that distributism adds to the new theories and practices, and one that is crucial. What is that element? In my opinion, it is that these movements pay little attention to the family and the community. For one serious effect of capitalism, and arguably its most damaging, is that the family has become a secondary consideration, if it is considered at all. Indeed, under capitalism, the family is little more than another consumer item. Great for those who like that product, but certainly not central to civilization and culture. Of course, the opposite is true. Nations need strong communities, and strong communities need strong families, and both need a secure economic base in order to survive at all. I think this is the crucial element which we add, and we are in a unique position to be able to accomplish this task. Capitalism marginalized the family, and it is up to the distributists to join with like-minded people to move the family back to the center of social and economic life. Thank you very much.